Good evening, everyone. On behalf of NYU SJP, we'd like to welcome you all to tonight's discussion, From Past to Present, Understanding the 100 Years War on Palestine and Gaza Today. Tonight, we're honored to have Professor Rashid, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, and Professor Sinan Atoon, Associate Professor at our NYU Gallatin School of Individualized Study. This discussion will delve into Khalidi's book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, and will hopefully provide crucial historical context for understanding the current crisis and violence in Gaza today. Afterwards, we'll have a short Q&A from the audience, moderated by members from NYU SJP. But first, this event couldn't have been possible without the support of our co-sponsors, NYU Faculty for Justice in Palestine, the NYU Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies, and the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. NYU faculty support for us NYU students who have been organizing on campus for Palestine over the past few months has been phenomenal and extremely helpful, so we thank you all so much. So this event will consist of a discussion between Professor Khalidi and Professor Atoon, then we'll flow into a Q&A from the audience. And basically how we're gonna go about doing this is we're gonna have a QR code on the screen, which you can scan right now. Yes, so at this time, scan your QR code, and this should take you to a Google form where you can submit questions throughout the discussion, and we'll have our SJP moderators kind of looking through your questions, and when we start the Q&A, we'll hopefully ask a few of those, and this will be up throughout the discussion as well. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Sinan Atoon is a poet, novelist, scholar, and translator. His scholarly works include The Poetics of the Obscene in Pre-Modern Arabic Poetry, and articles on modern Arabic poetry in the Journal of Palestine Studies, Journal of World Literature, and Journal of Arabic Literature. His op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and Jadaliyya, among others. He has published 5 novels and 2 collections of poetry. A third collection of poetry in English entitled Postcards from the Underworld was published by Siegel Books this past October. His most recent work in Arabic is Khuzama, and his literary translations from Arabic include Mahmoud Darwish's In the Presence of Absence, which won the National Translation Award given by the American Literary Translators Association, and Atoon's own novel, The Corpse Washer, which won the Arab American Book Prize. He is the associate professor at New York University, and he's the co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliyya. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Sinan.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Mana. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and to be with Professor Khalidi. Before presenting Professor Khalidi, I was asked to read a poem. I'm going to read a poem by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. It was written in the mid-90s, but it could have been written today as well. It's called Earth is Narrowing Around Us. Earth is narrowing around us, forcing us into the last passage. So we take off our body parts to pass through. Earth is squeezing us. If only we were sweet to die and live again. If only she were our mother to have mercy upon us. If only we were images of the rocks our dream will carry as mirrors. We saw the faces of those the last of us will kill in the final defense of our soul. We cried for their children's feast. We saw the faces of those who will throw our children out of the windows of this last space. Mirrors our star will polish. Where do we go after the last borders? Where do birds fly after the last sky? Where do plants sleep after the last air? We will write our names in crimson mist. We will sever the anthem's hand. Our flesh will finish it. We will die here, here in this last passage. Here or here, our blood will plant its olive trees. Professor Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia. He received his BA from Yale in 1970 and his doctorate from Oxford in 1974. He is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and was president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 91 until June 1993. He's the author of this book, highly recommended, The 100 Years of War in Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917-2017. Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, published in 2013. Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, 2009. The Iron Cage, The Story of the Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, 2006. Resurrecting Empire, Western Footprints and America's Perilous Path in the Middle East, in 2004. Palestinian Identity, The Construction of Modern National Consciousness, in 1996. Under Siege, PLO Decision-Making During the 1982 War in 1986. British Policy Towards Syria and Palestine, 1906-1914, published in 1980. And is co-editor of Palestine and the Gulf and the Origins of Arab Nationalism and The Other Jerusalem, Rethinking the History of the Sacred City in 2020. And many, many, many articles, of course. It's an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with Professor Khalidi. Thank you for writing this magisterial work. It's required reading for anyone interested in Palestine. We should also thank your son, Ismail, I guess, who, as you say, urged you to write it. You have said that it's a departure from your previous scholarly work in terms of the voice. Your personal memoirs, memories, and those of your extended family and their history are intertwined with the story you tell of the century of wars waged against Palestine and Palestinians. The first, many things caught my attention, but the first epigraph in the book is from Isa and Yusuf, and Isa written in May 7th, 1914. And the quote is, "We are a nation threatened with disappearance." So I wanted to ask you about the discursive erasure of Palestinians, which preceded and prepared for the implementation of the settler colonial project, and starting with the Balfour Declaration and the early Zionist writing, and how that erasure and displacing Palestinians from geography and history continues until today in various forms. And maybe you can also refer to the letter that we talked about, right? Use of Diya to Herzl, because it also addresses the erasure and describing Palestinians as others or inhabitants.
Well, thank you. And thanks to the organizers. Thanks to all of you for coming. Can you hear me, or should I raise my voice? And thank you for mentioning my son Ismail, who, among the many things that I think he deserves credit for, is adapting one of your novels for the stage, The Corpse Washer, which won a prize in Louisville. It's a wonderful novel. You should read it. I use that quote because I spent a great deal of time doing research, maybe 40 years ago, on early Arab reactions and Palestinian reactions to Zionism. And I discovered that long before the Balfour Declaration, which is where I start this book, there was deep, profound anxiety among Palestinians and many other people in the Arab world about what Zionism portended. They were surprisingly well informed about what was being thought of and what was being planned and what was being written in Eastern Europe, in Basel, First Zionist Congress, in Vienna, where Herzl himself came from, and in Europe generally. And they were deeply worried. The fact that as early as 1914, you had one of the leading newspapers in Palestine, which was published by Yusuf, dedicated dozens and dozens of articles to Zionism. And the quote that the epigraph to the book, actually, I think transmits this deep anxiety. They saw that a project was underway to replace them. They saw themselves as a people. The name of the newspaper was Palestine, which means Palestine. So there already was a sense I would argue, an early sense, but a sense of national identity there. And they saw that this was threatened by another project, a national project, which they also saw was a separate project. And they were afraid would obtain the support of foreign powers. And in fact, in 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, it did. And this has been a Palestinian fear, I'm arguing, even before this, because as you mentioned, you suggested that I talked about the letter that I started the first chapter of this book with. In 1899, an ancestor, a great uncle, had been the mayor of Jerusalem, who had served as a member of the Ottoman Parliament of 1877-78 as a deputy for Jerusalem. He built the first carriage road from Jerusalem to Jaffa. He brought water to the city. He was a reforming, modern, educated member of the Palestinian, who had lived many years in Austria. He had taught at the Imperial Royal University in Vienna. He probably didn't know Herzl, but he knew of Herzl, and he read German. And we found in the family library where his papers are, we found copies of Austrian newspapers that were his, directed to him, sent to him. So he knew about Zionism. He knew a great deal about it. He knew about the persecution of Jews. He knew about anti-Semitism. There are books on Judaism, books on anti-Semitism in his library, his personal library, which are now in the Khalidi library, in the family library, which I used as a source for this and other books. And so he wrote to Theodor Herzl in 1899 via the intermediary of somebody he knew from God knows where, the Grand Rabbi of France. And he said to him, we understand perfectly where Zionism comes from. I understand the degree of anti-Semitism and persecution that Jews are subjected to in Europe. We understand the connection of the Jews to this land. And he went into detail. It's clear that he knew a great deal about the Bible. He knew a great deal about Judaism from the letter. And we know that from his papers and his library, his teaching in Vienna. But the letter even shows this. He says, but there are problems with your project. I mean, in principle, the idea of a Jewish state, which, by the way, was the stated objective of the Zionist movement from the very beginning. Herzl had written a book called Der Judenstaat, the State of the Jews. He wrote another novelistic monograph called Alt Neuland, which was a vision of what Palestine would look like in the future after the Jewish state was established. There are very few Arabs there. There's one guy, Rashid, and there's pretty much no other Arabs. He knew these things. And he says to him, I understand where all of this is coming from, but there's a problem. This will create problems for Jews everywhere. First thing he said. The second thing he said is, there's a people here that will not be supplanted. And it's clear if you read the letter carefully, it was written in French from Istanbul, where he was in exile. Sultan Hamid had forced him to forced residence in Istanbul at this point. And he said, this people will not be supplanted. So for the sake of God, leave Palestine. Herzl replied to him, it was a letter I would describe in one word as a brush off. Courteous, but he ignored all of his concerns. He spoke to a concern that Yusuf Zia had not expressed, which is we have no intention of forcing the Palestinians to leave. But he never said that in the letter. So this is something that was obviously in Herzl's subconscious when he wrote his response. So that's how I begin this one.
Oh, thank you. The great thing, many of the great things in this book is that, of course, from the subtitle, it's settler colonialism and resistance. So at every point, you make sure to stress and highlight the resistance and resilience of Palestinians despite the powerful forces arrayed against them at every juncture. So I think it would be useful for those who haven't read the book and everyone to speak a little bit about the 1936 revolt and what distinguishes it and what effects it had. And also the massive British brutality and some of the techniques that the Zionists and the Israelis will pick up and continue.
Right. One of the less well-known and much ignored, actually, but I think seminal episodes in Palestinian history is the Great Revolt of 1936. it bespeaks something that has been denied by many Zionists, which is that the Palestinians obviously had there was a national cohesion. You would not have had a 3-year revolt in which 14 to 17% of the adult male population was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled, had there not been a sense of some sense of national consciousness. We know that that's the case from newspapers published even before World War I. We know this is the case from a sporting club established in, of all places, Santiago in 1922, Palestino. It's still a football club to this day. They wouldn't have named it Palestino if they didn't think of themselves as Palestinians. They established a Palestine club in Santiago, which is actually the biggest of these fabulous clubs. There's a German club, there's a Dutch club, there are all a whole bunch of them. This is the most extensive. The Palestinian community in Chile is huge, hundreds of thousands of people, and very well established. The point is, this sense of identity existed as early as this period, the 20s to 30s. By the 1930s, the Palestinians had it with the British and with their support of the Zionist movement. And finally, they rose up in 1936. And they launched this revolt in which, as I mentioned, a very large proportion of Palestinian adult males were killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. My uncle was exiled. The whole leadership was exiled. Dozens and dozens of millions were executed. Many of them summarily, shot after capture. Others, about 100, were hanged. This eviscerated the Palestinian national movement. It broke the back of armed resistance. And it laid the groundwork for what was to happen in the 1940s, when the struggle for Palestine developed after the partition plan of 1947. The British, interestingly, had several problems in putting this revolt in. The first problem was they couldn't trust the most important element in their colonial repression apparatus, which was the British Indian Army, because they didn't trust the Indian troops to shoot the Palestinians. And you get stuff from the Secretary of State in India or from the Viceroy. They say, we don't have enough troops to put this revolt down. It's the largest interwar colonial revolt in the entire world, this 3-year revolt. And the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army writes back and he says, well, I'd love to send some troops, but I'm not sure they'd be loyal if we send them to Palestine. They may go over to Palestine. They may go over to Palestine. They had another problem because it was a crisis in Europe. The Anschluss, Austria, the Sudetenland crisis, so they couldn't send English troops. What did they do? They started to recruit auxiliaries from among the Zionist militias. The person who was the pioneer in this was an officer by the name of Ord Wingate. He was an intelligence officer, particularly nasty character, who put together what he called special night squads, British commandos, together with leading figures who were chosen from the Palmach and Haganah militias, in order to carry the war to the Palestinians, attack villages that were suspected to be bases for the guerrillas, to carry out punitive raids, to destroy homes, to shoot prisoners, to torture people. There are accounts of him lining up people and pouring sand or oil down their throats, and if they didn't answer the questions, shooting, personally shooting, and then ordering his British and Jewish soldiers to shoot prisoners. Ord Wingate was a piece of work, but he was a theorist of counterinsurgency. And the British just didn't have enough troops, and so they were using these methods to suppress the Palestinians. These methods have 2 afterlives. One of the afterlives is they're being picked up by other British officers who end up serving all over the British Empire after World War II. One of the most notable of whom is a man named Sir Frank Kitson, who ended his career in Northern Ireland, where the same techniques were used by troops under his personal command from the Parachute Brigade in the Ballymurphy Massacre of 1971 and the Bloody Sunday Massacre in Derry in 1972. So there's an arc that goes from other British imperial outposts through Palestine, and one part of it ends up in other parts of the empire, and finally in Northern Ireland. The other branch is the individuals trained by Wingate. They included people whose names you might know: Moshe Dayan, Yigal Allon, men who became generals in the Israeli army, men who became chiefs of staff of the Israeli army. Both of them become ministers. Dayan becomes Minister of Defense by the 1960s. They write that Wingate taught us everything we know. The histories of these, the best histories of the Israeli army, one of which is written by Atoon, another of which is written by a man called Rashid, the military correspondent of Haaretz for many, many years, describe Wingate as the father of the doctrine of Israel. And you have to go back and read what kind of person Wingate was to understand what was being imparted to his mentees by this man. The kind of techniques of torture, murder of prisoners, attacks on unarmed civilians, and so on. This is what he was teaching. And this is what he taught other British officers later on who served in different parts of the empire after World War II. And this is what ended up killing a lot of people in Belfast. The counter-gang strategy, attacking the civilian population that supposedly supported the guerrillas. And this is the doctrine of the Israeli army. There are squares and monuments to Wingate all over Israel. He is the father of Israel.
Moving on to 1948 and the Nakba, which I think even those who are aware of it, I guess I would like you to speak a little bit about the long-term effects of the Nakba on Palestinian society and how it mutilated Palestine. And you describe it as a train wreck that's slowly taking place. And then, of course, you mentioned the personal effects on your own family, on your grandparents and losing their home. And the picture on the cover of the book is your grandfather's ruins, which are still standing outside of Tel Aviv. So if you could just address that a little bit, like the general terms, but personal as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I am what I am because of the Nakba, because my dad and my mom were in Palestine in 1946, 47. And my father was a PhD student at Columbia and was planning to come back to Palestine after he finished and couldn't because of the Nakba. His father's house had been occupied, partially destroyed, the family was scattered. He ended up staying here. I was born here as a result. So my personal trajectory had nothing to do with the Nakba directly. I was born afterwards, but I was born here because of the Nakba. That's why I had the perfect year, guys. It comes out more in moments of stress. Yes. So the Nakba, you know, it's usually coded as part of the Arab-Israeli wars, the wars between the Arab states and Israel, which in this framing start with the entry of the Arab armies into Palestine on May 15th, 1948, at which point the British mandate ends. The British give up responsibility for Palestine. The partition that the UN General Assembly has voted for is supposed to come into effect. The state of Israel is established. An Arab state is never established. And Arab armies enter Palestine. In fact, the Nakba starts earlier. The Nakba starts almost as soon as the partition resolution is passed. Partition was a typical British solution, even though the British weren't actually behind this specific iteration. It's a typical British solution to colonial situations, implemented first in Ireland in 1921, implemented in Palestine, though not by the British, by the UN General Assembly, implemented in India at almost the same time, implemented later in Cyprus. It's a result of a policy of divide and rule. It's a result of playing one ethnic or religious group off against another, of dividing the majority as much as possible in order to ensure imperial hegemony. And from the moment partition was voted on, giving most of a majority Arab country to the Jewish minority, 55% of Palestine was to be given to 35% of the population, which owned about 6% of the land. So it involved a massive injustice, a violation of the principle of self-determination, and a massive injustice to the Palestinians. The Palestinians rejected it. They were in no position to resist now. Their back of Palestinian resistance had been broken by the British 8 years before, during the revolt. Their leaders were mostly still in exile. My uncle was kept in exile until 1944. They sent him to the Seychelles in 1937, together with half the Palestinian leadership. Others fled. Others were sent by the British to Kenya. Others were sent to Malta. Others were kept in detention camps, later repurposed by the Israelis after 1948. And many others were killed or exiled or fled. And so the Palestinians were really unable to resist that. By May 15th, 1948, the Arab population of the city of Haifa, about 70,000 people, had been driven from their homes. In April, the population of the Arab population of the city of Jaffa, which is now part of the Tel Aviv municipality, about 70,000 people had been driven from their homes. The Arab population of the western neighborhoods of Jerusalem, there were some Jewish and some Arab, about 30,000 people, had been driven from their homes. Arab population of Safa, which is a mixed city, had been driven from their homes. The Arab population of Bisan, the Arab population of Tiberias, all had been driven from their homes, as well as the population of dozens and dozens of villages. I can describe how and why, what the planning was, what the intention was. The point is, by May 15th, while Britain was still technically in control of Palestine, before the state of Israel had been established, the militias that later become the Israeli army had already conquered large Arab areas of Palestine and had driven out about 300,000 people, including the majority of the Arab urban population in Palestine. Another 450,000 were expelled or forced to leave or fled after May 15th when the Arab armies entered Palestine. And the timing here is very important. Why did the Arab armies enter Palestine? They entered to destroy the Jewish state. Actually, they entered for a variety of reasons, last of which might have been an attempt to defeat and destroy the Jewish state, most important of which was to do something about the flight of hundreds of thousands of penniless, destitute Palestinians into their countries. Damascus, Sidon, Beirut, Amman were being flooded with refugees before May 15, 1948. And so if you look into the history of when the Egyptians or the Iraqis or the Jordanians or the Syrians, the four countries that sent armies to Palestine, decided to do this, they decided to do this in May 1948, not because they wanted to destroy Israel necessarily, some of them may have had that idea, but mainly as a response to this crisis, because they saw perfectly well that if something wasn't done, not just 300,000 Palestinians, not just, in fact, many hundreds of thousands more Palestinians would be driven from Palestine, but what was to become the Israeli army would conquer the whole country. The last thing I want to say about the Nakba, which relates to your question, is that it really tore the heart out of a very large part of Palestinian society. They were not just made refugees. They did not just lose their homes or their property, which was the case for almost all of them. They lost everything. It turned Palestinian society upside down. A large part of the elites had been urban. I mean, there were cities that were not occupied. Nazareth, what becomes part of Israel, was not occupied. Memphis, part of East Jerusalem, Hebron were not occupied. Gaza City was not occupied. But the most prosperous, the most important cities in Palestine were Jaffa and Haifa, both completely empty of their population, almost. And that destroyed the Arab economy of Palestine. It destroyed much of the cultural and intellectual elite of Palestine. Most of the newspapers were published in Haifa and Jaffa, for example. Most of the important theaters, most of the important culture, art, whatever, were in those two cities. There was some in Jerusalem, there were some in other cities, but they were backwards by comparison with these two major urban ports. The last thing that I would say about the Nakba is that it did to Palestinian society something that had long-term effects, in the sense that it completely destroyed the power and the prestige of the tradition. People like my uncle ceased to have. My uncle was a major political figure in the 20s and the 30s, or at least the 30s and the 40s. These people ceased to have any influence. They lost their wealth, they lost their prestige. People like the Mufti, who had been the head of the Palestinian National League, completely discredited. You have been defeated. You have led us to defeat. And you no longer have any wealth or any status. And it opened the way for an entirely new generation and a new class of people to take the lead in Palestinian society, not only politically, culturally, intellectually, and so on. And you have people like Mohammed Darwish and Bassem Kenafani in the world of arts and literature, and you have the politicians who lead Palestinian politics coming from completely different classes from the ones who had dominated Palestinian society and failed to meet the challenge of the British and Zionists.
And then, of course, the Palestinians inside Israel, because that's one of the myths that Zionists keep perpetrating, were, under military rule from 1948 until 1966.
Right.
And they were, second-class citizens by all means. I was going to ask you about, because, we're still living with the United States, of course, providing diplomatic cover and weapons for Israel. I was going to ask you about in 1967 when your father was working at the UN and there was a delay of the resolution, and you were asking why, and your father was telling you, well,
You want me to tell that story?
yes, briefly, because we need to go to Beirut and 82, and that's we have so much to cover. 100 years.
And 30 minutes. And we don't have a long time, I understand. Let me just say one thing about the United States. One of the points I'm trying to make in this book is that it's not just a war between Israelis and Palestinians. This is not just the two, like two gladiators standing there, okay? And depending on how you look at it, it's David and Goliath, or it's Goliath and David. But it's not just the two. There's always the big, fat thumb of the great imperial power of the age on one side of the scales. And it's not the Palestinians. It's the British Army, 100,000 troops, the Royal Air Force, that crushes the Palestinians from 36 to 49. It's not the Haganah. It's not the Pop. It's not the Jewish settlement police. It's not the Army. It's the British Army. And it's not poor little Israel all by itself that wins the 1948 war. It's very small Israel fighting against big and serious odds, supported by the two superpowers of the post-World War II era, the United States and the Soviet Union, both of which arm, recognize, and support Israel in the 1948 war. And today, it's not Israel fighting in Gaza alone. It's Israel and every 120 millimeter cannon shell from Merkava tanks is arriving on C5As daily. They don't have the ammunition without daily American resupply. Every single 155 millimeter artillery shell is being daily resupplied by the United States. Every Hellfire missile is being daily resupplied by them. The United States and Israel are fighting in Gaza today. And I insist on that, not only because I watch the United States maneuvers in the Security Council that I'm about to describe, or we can see the same maneuvers decades later today in the security. They're fiddling with the resolution even as we speak. 100 people are dying a day, and the United States has delayed a fourth resolution. And God knows when it will be passed, if it's passed, and what it will do, if anything. Anyway, to the 67. My dad worked in what was then called Political and Security Council Affairs, and his job was to sit in the Security Council behind the Undersecretary and prepare reports and prepare documents for the members of the Secretariat, Secretary General, and the Undersecretary as they dealt with the crises dealing with the Middle East. So all of his colleagues in Political and Security Council Affairs who dealt with other parts of the world had an easy life. The Middle East covered about 50% of the time of the Security Council. So he and his colleagues were very, very busy individuals. And I had just finished, I think it was my first year in college, and I came to New York, and I went down to the United Nations every day with my father to sit in the visitors gallery in the Security Council when the council was in session, or to sit in his office and watch what was going on. And so I was in the council chamber, I believe it was on the 4th day of the war, or the 5th day of the 6-day war. And I was watching as urgent efforts were being made by the Soviet Union and India and several other members of the council to bring about a ceasefire as Israeli troops advanced in the Golan Heights. By this time, Israel had conquered the Sinai Peninsula, defeated the Egyptian army, conquered the West Bank and East Jerusalem, defeated the Jordanian army, and defeated the Syrian army, and was advancing on the Golan Heights towards Damascus. And there was an effort to bring about a ceasefire. And a resolution was tabled. And then Ambassador Goldberg, who was the permanent observer of the United States, permanent representative of the United States, asked for a break. He said, "I'd like to have a recess." And they stopped, and everybody got up, and they walked out of the chamber. And I waited for my father to come out and said, "What the hell's happening? Israeli army is advancing every minute. It makes a difference as whether they get to Damascus or not. Why did Goldberg ask for a recess?" And my father they said he wanted to consult with his government. So when you consult with his government, the government's right up I-95. He's picked up the phone and he's giving the Israelis more time. What's wrong with you? He was The taste? Are you stupid? He didn't say that. That's what his expression was. You don't understand. And that's what the United States does. It's running interference for the Israelis. And that's, that encapsulates everything that's happened in the United Nations, pretty much since 1947 and until, unfortunately, the present day.
Thank you. And I mean, the book you described so well, the rise of the PLO and all the factors that led to that. But I wanted to, well, first I want to read this quote from page 156. The symbol of this war was becoming a picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off. That's not about today. That is Reagan writing in his diaries. When the Israeli brutality in Lebanon was so horrendous that Reagan told Begin that this is almost a Holocaust. But I wanted to, because when October 7th took place, but the response to October 7th and the ongoing genocide, many people were reminded of the siege and the bombing of Beirut, which we lived through. And you know what I said in the beginning about displacing Palestinians from history and geography is not a metaphor. This, of course, the 1982 was about displacing the Palestinian resistance from Lebanon, taking them out as far away as possible. But again, also you pointedly write about how the war started earlier with the assassination of 3 Palestinian leaders by none other than Ehud Barak. So I mean, we're all tired of this, but we have to keep saying it about how Israeli terrorism is self-defense, right? It's not state terrorism. This a terrorist becomes a prime minister. But
it can happen on both sides. We're going to talk about that in a minute.
Okay, balance it. And then when you like balance. Oh, they like balance. You say it was because 50,000 people were killed in the 7-week siege invasion, and then even the Mossad guy says
about 20.
A total of 50,000. Right?
Casualties. 20,000 killed. 50,000 casualties. About 19 or 20,000 killed.
But you say it was a watershed moment in terms of scale, aim, duration, and long-range impact. And once again, U.S. green light support and responsibility was most shameful subsidiary aspect was the capitulation of leading Arab regimes to American pressure while governments loudly proclaiming their support for Palestinians, which is almost constant from 1947 until today. But just about the long-term effects of the 82 invasion of Beirut.
Right. Well, I mean, this is a chapter that was actually very hard for me to write because I'd never written it. It starts with my own experience, and it includes different parts of the narrative, other experiences, ours, mine, my wife's, and my kids, 2 of my kids who had been born by this time, in Beirut during the siege of Beirut. The war took place starting in June of 1982, and the ceasefire was finally imposed after Reagan said what he said. It took 1 hour between Reagan calling Begin and the Israeli army ceasefire. It's taken us 5 months. Today marks 5 months that this war has been going on. And Biden has still not picked up the phone and done what Ronald Reagan, one of the most fervent supporters of Israel in American history, managed to do with 1 phone call. Doing exactly what you said. Telling Begin this is going to be a Holocaust. And he used the word advisively. The history that people have written about said. The war was not just an Israeli war. Again, before he launched this offensive, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Ariel Sharon, later Prime Minister, came to Washington. He met with Secretary of State Alexander Haig. He laid out the plan. He said, we intend to expel the PLO from Lebanon. He said, we intend to drive the Syrians out of Lebanon. And he said, we intend to install a government that will make peace with Israel. Israel succeeded in the first and the third of those objectives. Haig gave a green light to this war, and the United States supplied the weapons necessary for this war. They bombed us mainly with American planes. They shelled us entirely with American artillery. This was an American-Israeli war, would be my argument. one sanctioned by the United States, protected in the Security Council from Security Council action by the United States, armed by the United States, and stopped in the end by the United States. The United States did the negotiations whereby the PLO was evacuated from Beirut, and the United States imposed the ceasefire when President Reagan finally decided the time was ready. I could say more about the 82, but I think that's
Okay.
Unless you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, there's so much to say, but I mean, it's very important, the personal stories and how.
Let me say one other thing. I just thought of something else. I mean, at the beginning of this war, this phase of this war, the October 7th war, when the bombardment and then the ground offensive into Gaza began, after the horrors of the 7th of October, and we absorbed those, and then the offensive into Gaza. My wife and I and a few of us who've been in Beirut, we're talking about how different this is from the siege that we endured. The Israeli army cut off water, cut off fuel, cut off food, it shut down the telephones and shut down electricity in Beirut in 1982. But the deprivation that resulted was nothing like what is going on. I mean, this is so much worse than anything that we experienced in Beirut. There were 50,000 casualties, Lebanese and Palestinian in Lebanon in 1980. About 20,000 killed, about 30. The numbers are not precise. They're Lebanese government figures. I don't think they're accurate. I think the number's probably higher. But anyway, that's the number that we have. We already have, in 5 months, at least 40,000 people killed in Gaza. The number of those who have been counted is over 30,000, and there are 8,000, at least 8,000 missing. The number of wounded is over 70,000. This is an infinitely larger toll. And the suffering is infinitely greater in a much smaller area than 1982. This is infinitely worse. This is the worst casualty toll in Palestinian history. There were 15,000 people killed in 1948. There were 19,000 Palestinians and Lebanese killed in 1982. We're already probably over 40,000. If you count the missing under the rubble, that's very likely. And we're not finished. This war is not over. It's also the highest civilian casualty toll since 1948 in Israel. The highest civilian casualty toll in Israel since 1948.
I mean, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to jump to one because I'm not sure if we have time. But on towards the end,
we're good. Boss says we're good.
Well, you're right about the paradoxical result of the major events and aftermath of the invasion of Beirut and the exodus of the PLO, but there was a gradual shifting of the center of gravity back to Palestine.
Right.
And the outbreak of the first Intifada in Gaza. Right. Just like the Nakba, this new defeat produced resistance. And so just a little bit about Intifada, but also about the Gaza and how it's been
right.
the side of the Israelis since the 50s, and it's been the place that has actually given birth to all of the major leaders of Palestinian resistance of various factions.
I mean, if you look at the whole war since 1917, and you understand what is at issue, it is what an early Zionist leader, Zev Jabotinsky, called an attempt to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. To, in effect, replace a name, people, with another name and another. It was not an attempt to share Palestine. It was not an attempt to partition. It was an attempt to take over the whole place and transform. And that can only be done in the majority Arab country, but ethnic cleansing. And so there's been a systematic process of ethnic since 1914. There's been a systematic process of expelling as many people as possible and forcing the remainder into the smallest possible area. And that is exactly what we're seeing in Gaza today. But Gaza has been the focus of Palestinian resistance to this process because Gaza is the most extreme example of this process. Gaza contains over 80% of its population as people who were forced out of the southern parts of what became Israel in 1948. The population of what was Beersheba, Beersheba today. The population of what was Ashdod today. And a dozen other towns scores of other villages were driven in 1948 into the Gaza Strip and have lived there in this tiny space ever since 1948. Since it symbolizes and encapsulates the most extreme version of what is being done grosso modo all over Palestine, it's not surprising that back in the 50s it was the focus of resistance. After the Israeli occupation in 1967, it was the main focus of resistance. And ever since, it's been the main focus. The leadership of Fatah developed largely in the Gaza Strip. The most militant leaders of the Palestinian Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine developed in the Gaza Strip. Hamas and Islamic Jihad developed in the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip has been, for the reasons that have to do with how the Gaza Strip was created, for reasons that have to do with who the people who live in Gaza are, for reasons that have to do with how they have been treated since 1948, and especially since the occupation in 1967, you understand why it has been and is to this day a locus of Palestinians.
Thank you. You're right about, of course, the Oslo Accords and what a great disaster and how they in fact constituted another internationally sanctioned American-Israeli declaration of war on the Palestinians in furtherance of the Zionist movement's century-old project. But unlike 47 and 67, this time Palestinian leaders allow themselves to be drawn into complicity with their adversaries. And you're right about the various failures of Arafat and others to appreciate and understand the United States, but also the disastrous choice of envoys who were sent to negotiate who did not have the wherewithal or the skills or the training to even understand the maps.
Right.
And
or the language, or the legal aspect.
And how Oslo became a cage that actually further fragmented Palestinian society and even restricted the movement that a lot of Palestinians had before and eventually led to.
Second.
Yes.
Well, you summarized the whole chapter very well. Great job. I mean, I don't need to say anything. I begin that chapter with my own experiences again. I was made the mistake of agreeing in a moment of weakness when asked by the late Faisal Husseini whether I would be an advisor to the Palestinian delegation if there were negotiations. And I foolishly, unthinkingly said, yeah, sure.
You didn't think they were going to happen?
I was sure there wouldn't be negotiations. Yitzhak Shamir was prime minister of Israel. Under no circumstances was he going to negotiate with the Palestinians. And so I said, sure, I'll be an advisor to this delegation that will never be formed for negotiations that will never take place. And the next thing I knew, I got a phone call saying, come down, man, we're going to Madrid. And I had to go to Madrid. And what we learned in Madrid, the advisors, people like me and the members of the delegation, who were handpicked by the PLO, but were chosen with reference to Israeli considerations and Israeli conditions, such that nobody associated with the PLO could be in the delegation. Nobody from Jerusalem could be in the delegation. And nobody from the diaspora could be. So people from the delegation had to be vetted by the Israelis. So I was outside the delegation, I was an advisor. And what we very quickly learned is that there were peace negotiations going on between Israel and Syria, Israel and Jordan, Israel and Lebanon. And in the case of Jordan, they led to a treaty. In the case of Syria, they almost led to a treaty, and they would have led to a treaty. It had conditions been slightly different. In the case of the Palestinians, we were not negotiating peace. We were not allowed to negotiate peace. We were allowed to negotiate self-rule under continued Israeli occupation and colonization. That was the ceiling. It was about this low. You could not talk about borders. You could not talk about sovereignty. You could not talk about statehood. You could not talk about water. You could not talk about settlements. You could not talk about Jerusalem. You could not talk about refugees. You could talk about autonomy, self-rule. And what I quickly realized was that this could not lead, and then the other issues were supposedly going to be discussed in final status negotiations that were supposed to take place by 1998, and the interim structure that was supposed to be created was temporary. Well, the temporary is still there. That's the Palestinian Authority. What you see is what we, who went to the negotiations in Madrid, and then most of them took place in Washington, in the basement of the State Department, were negotiations that could not and would not and were not intended to lead to Palestinian statehood, or sovereignty, or self-determination, or independence. They were essentially intended to extend into the indefinite future the status quo of occupation and the status quo of colonization of the West Bank, and at the time, also of the Gaza Strip. There were a number of settlements in the Gaza Strip. The negotiations petered out in the summer of 1993. And we did not know at the time that Arafat and the PLO had sent a delegation of people who were, as you suggested, utterly unqualified to negotiate with the Israelis, to Oslo, where they came up with the Oslo Accords that were signed on the White House lawn in September of 1983. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that day, in which I said, this is not going to lead. This does not bode well. And I felt completely justified when, in his last speech to the Knesset, 2 years after the Oslo Accords were signed, Rabin, one of the signatories, told the Israeli Knesset, what we are offering the Palestinians is less than a state. What we're offering them includes Israeli security control over the Jordan River Valley. In other words, over access to this, less than a state. In other words, this was the Israeli bottom line. He was assassinated a few weeks later. This was 1995, I'm sorry. So I argue in the book exactly as you said. Oslo was a trap, it was a cage. Palestinian GDP per capita went down from the Oslo Accords until 2000, from 93 until 2000. Palestinian freedom of movement was enormously restricted. You could move freely before the Oslo Accord from anywhere in the occupied territories to anywhere else in the occupied territories, as well as to the Golan Heights, to Tel Aviv, to Eilat. The entirety of Greater Israel was open to you from anywhere in the West Bank or anywhere in Gaza. We drove into Gaza, my cousin and I once. There was an Israeli soldier sitting on a chair, tipping himself like anything. That was the security between the West Bank and Gaza. That was not, you could move anywhere. Starting with Oslo, fences, walls, checkpoints, restrictions on movement, passes. Most Palestinians in Gaza never were able to leave Gaza from that point on. Population of Gaza, since the 90s, has never, very, very few exceptions, medical, going out via Cairo to have a university education. With those few exceptions, the population of the Gaza Strip has never been allowed to leave the Gaza Strip. That was not the case before us. So these indignities, these humiliations imposed in the name of the so-called peace process, together with the reinforcement of occupation and the expansion of settlement, is what produced another intifada in 2000.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of other questions, but I just wanted to, well, just a brief comment about I mean, there's no time you can answer later, but you end on an ominous note, and rightly so, about where you say that there's a still possibility that Israel could attempt to reprise the expulsion of 1948 and 1967, and that even though that would do fatal damage to the West's support of Israel, nevertheless, there are growing fears that expulsion has become more possible in the past few years than any other time since 1948. That's something just for all of you to think about what's at stake here, because most of you know what's happening in the West Bank and what's happening everywhere inside the state of Israel. But also just one point about, that's been brought up by others about the timing, because everyone asks about the timing, but you say how, the centenary of the war on Palestine came and went. American Metropole, the irreplaceable base for Israel's freedom of action, was as committed to the Zionist colonial project as had been Lord Balfour 100 years earlier. The second century of the war would be marked by a new and even more destructive approach to Palestine, with the US in close coordination with Israel and its newfound friends in the absolute monarchies of the Gulf. And so perhaps what was at stake was that the entire Palestinian question was going to be liquidated had the normalization with Saudi Arabia was signed. So perhaps the timing is not at all arbitrary in terms of the October 7th attack, but that's maybe will come up in the Q&A. Sorry for it. I just wanted to put this out.
Thank you for that really insightful conversation. We will be moving on to the Q&A portion, and we've received many questions, so we'll try to address as many as we can. One that keeps repeatedly showing up is what about the U.S. wanting an allied position in the Middle East? So
But the U.S.
The U.S. wanting an allied position in the Middle East. What do you think the U.S. would give Israel about their unconditional financial and public support? Like, what's in it for the U.S. when it comes to?
Okay. Yeah. Should I answer the questions one at a time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. It sometimes seems counterintuitive. Why this degree of support? Why this no daylight between the United States and Israel? Why this sense that Israel, which has received more American aid than any other country on earth, has this level of support, receives American weapon systems that are, as they're being integrated as the American military, they're being integrated in Israel. The F-35 fighter. And some people ascribe it to electoral considerations. Some people ascribe it to the Israeli army. I think you have to look a lot deeper. I think those are obviously elements, but I think you have to look at the way the American elite sees its interests in the Middle East, sees Israel and has seen Israel really since very early on as a strategic asset, sees it as helping to control and dominate the region for the United States. I really don't think that there's a huge amount. If you look at American presidents from Truman through Trump, I actually don't think there's a great deal of personal or ideological sympathy for Israel per se. They repeat the words that they're supposed to repeat. They repeat the slogans, only democracy in the Middle East made the desert bloom, blah, 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 blah. They say those things. But I think that what motivates this level of American support for Israel is the sense that it is an irreplaceable, valuable ally for the United States in a variety of ways. And in ways that have to do with control and domination of the Middle East. And this goes right back, in some respects, to 1948. I can talk about the details of how American strategic thinking changed. There's another element, and this is an element that has to do with ideology. And this is a sense, we are a separate colonial society. Where the United States is a society that was built on expulsion and ethnic cleansing. And it's a society in which the idea of the frontier and the idea of holding off the natives comes naturally. I mean, most of you are probably too young to have seen the kind of movies I grew up watching. But that's what people saw. Cowboys and Indians. The cowboys are the good guys, the Indians are the bad guys. And there's a kinship there that Israel has played on, and that is legitimate. There is a kinship between separate colonial societies. They're very different in many respects. But, so there's an ideological element. Finally, there's a religious element. Not just for people in the American Jewish community, but for a very large part of evangelical Protestants in this country. It is an imperative for them to support Zionism. And this is not new. Long before political Zionism appeared, decades before Herzl, you had people like Lord Shaftesbury in England, important British politicians, important British cultural figures, bishops of the Anglican Church, insisting that it was a duty incumbent on Christians to return the Jews to the land of Israel. Zionism in the United Kingdom does not begin with Chaim Weizmann during World War I. Zionism in Britain begins with British Protestants who believe that this is the thing that is important for them to do. That is still a factor in this country among evangelical Protestants. The Republican Party is not only pro-Israel, because the Republican Party believes in war and domination, and they like hard-ass militaries like the Israeli military. That's part of it. Most of the much more important part is that a huge part of the Republican electorate is made up of people who have these religious beliefs. And that's true right across the political spectrum, obviously. There are others, Christians, Jews, and others, who believe this as well, for religious reasons. I would say that's the third most important reason, frankly. Finally, you have electoral politics. Our politicians want our votes. But our politicians spend almost all of their time raising money. And the people who give them big amounts of money, they pay a lot of attention to. And a lot of people who give them big amounts of money care a great deal about Israel for a variety of reasons, whether they're evangelicals or whether they're American Zionists for strategic reasons, or whether they have religious beliefs, or whatever the reason. Money talks. We live in private universities, which are essentially financial institutions. Our media are controlled by billionaires and multi-billionaires. Our economic institutions are, and our politicians are. They're bought and sold. They spend all their time raising money. So they're worried about votes, but they're also worried about it. And money is important. If you look at the money being spent by AIPAC on elections this cycle, the millions of dollars that are going into defeating a Jamal Bowman, or that are going to go into trying to defeat a Cory Bush, or an Ilhan Omar, you can see the importance of money in American politics. It's true right across the spectrum. It has to do with every issue. It has to do with reproductive rights. It has to do with the Second Amendment. It has to do with climate. It has to do with every issue. Money is enormously important. I'm not saying votes are not important. So this is part of it as well.
And then we also see a lot of mention of Western allyship with Israel and the Zionist project. And one big question is asking, where are the Arab states in this equation? What will it take for the Arab nations to step in? Specifically also in calling for economic and military sanctions now on Israel.
The Arabs are one thing. No, the Arab peoples are one thing. The Arab regimes are another thing. You have in the Arab world one of the most intensely dark black holes as far as democracy is concerned. Almost every other region of the globe has seen some movement towards democracy and sometimes backsliding. Latin America, East Asia, South Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. They were all under various types of dictatorships, military, party, at different times during the Cold War. If you look at what's happened since then, in almost all of them, there's been some democratization in many of them. That has not happened at all in the Arab world. On the contrary, Arab regimes have grown more autocratic, more repressive, more responsive to external powers, in fact, more aligned with external powers, meaning the United States, essentially, but also Western Europe, and sometimes other great powers, China, Russia, and have had more and more contempt for the sentiments of their peoples. If you look at the peoples, there are polls. There are polls done by American pollsters. There are polls done by the Arab Center in Qatar. Overwhelming majorities of the Arab peoples in every single country polled are extremely supportive of the Palestinians. So the question is not where are the Arabs? The question are, who do these governments represent? Well, they don't represent their own people. They are not representative. They represent the kleptocracies, the autocracies, the absolute monarchies that would make Louis XIV blush, that blight the Arab world, from Morocco to the Gulf. That's what you have in the Arab world. You have regimes lacking domestic legitimacy, in some cases entirely dependent on external support for their security, their external and their internal security. Saudi government has been propped up by a national guard that was created by, what's the name of the corporation? Some corporation, an American corporation, of course, and Aramco. Over decades, the Saudi monarchy was created in large part by the British. There was a guy called Captain Shakespeare who rode with Ibn Saud, same name, without the E. He was killed in battle, actually, fighting Ibn Rashid or something. It doesn't matter. The Brits gave Ibn Saud the guns that he rode and the horses that he rode from Kuwait to Riyadh in 1902 to establish the modern Saudi kingdom. External support is essential to the maintenance and sustenance of these regimes. So of course they're responsive to what Washington wants. And that means they're responsive to what Israel. And that's why you have most Arab countries have diplomatic relations of some sort, whether they're admitted or unadmitted, with Israel. And most of them are, in my view, and in the view of most Palestinians, and in the view of their peoples, hostile to the Palestinian cause. So where are the Arabs has to be, you have to answer that question in two ways. The Arab peoples are in one place, and their reprehensible governments are in another.
Considering the unremitting flow of brutal imagery we see coming out of Gaza every day, do you think that the inaction or complicity of Arab leaders in the face of this genocide could provide the spark that would ignite another Arab Spring?
Okay, that question has triggered the response that I always give to questions like this, which is that I'm a historian, and the job description of a historian does not include predicting the future. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody expected the uprisings of 2010, 11, 12 in the area. I'm not a betting man. I've never bet. I will never bet. I don't do that. If somebody had asked me in 2010, are there going to be upheavals in Cairo or in Tunis or in Damascus or in Bahrain or in any of these countries? I mean, absolutely not. You're out of your mind. Here's $100. I would have been wrong. And I won't speculate. I believe that there are pressures inside a number of these countries from people I talk to who are in Saudi Arabia or in Morocco or in Jordan or other Arab countries. There are enormous pressures from below on the regimes. Will this lead to a breakdown of their repressive apparatuses? Allah, God knows. I will say that they have been grown infinitely more adept at controlling and repressing their peoples. One reason you suggested that the Arab countries have never done anything for Palestine. That's not actually true. In 1948, they went to war partly because of what was happening to the Palestinians. Now, why did they do that? Were these representative regimes? Not really. But they were weak before their own peoples. They had to act. Arab governments have grown stronger and less responsive to their peoples since the 1940s. Will that change in 2024? I don't know. I hope that this terrible status quo will be shaken and that governments will be forced to act more forcefully.
How do you think the accessibility of information and primary sources on the internet makes this different from previous military campaigns against the Palestinians?
Yeah, I think that a revolution has taken place that has created, most notably, a huge gap between generations. Older people who rely on corporate legacy traditional media live in one world and don't know anything, actually, about what's happening in Palestine because it is rigorously, systematically censored. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, ABC, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, systematically, rigorously censored. You can't say this. There's a style sheet. People are fired from their jobs if they dare put their noses across the line. I've talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of journalists since this war began. The young ones tell me the same thing. We can't do this. They won't let us do that. They make us do this. I had a journalist from the New York Post tell me that the other day. The New York Post, the most gutter newspaper in the United States. The most pro-Israel rag on this continent. On the other hand, most of you wouldn't pay attention to the legacy media if you were paid to do so. I mean, you may get something from the Times in one of your feeds or on social media or through alternative media, or the Intercept will tell you the enormities of the reporting of the New York Times. But you're not going to read the New York Times or watch CNN, heaven forbid. So this has caused a revolution, which is partially generational. I mean, there are a lot of older people who are sensitive to reality. I'm not suggesting everybody over the age of X is hopeless. No, most of them are. Not all. And I'm not suggesting everybody under the age of X is enlightened. Most of them are, but not all. But to the extent to which people have access to feeds directly from Gaza, they are seeing what older people will never see and are not allowed to see. They're seeing people starving to death. They're seeing people being shot down as they're trying to get food. They're seeing exactly what happens when a university is blown up and the soldiers are doing it or laughing as they push the button. They see those things. Once you see those things, you can't unsee them. So it's not just text, it's images that are widely available. And there's good stuff and bad stuff in social media, and there's good stuff and bad stuff in non-traditional media, obviously. But there's almost only bad stuff in the traditional. That's the point. You at least have a choice. You can look at garbage and you can look at good stuff. Whereas if you go to the legacy media, you mainly get going. As far as this issue, sir.
A lot of Israelis claim that they left Gaza in 2005. Can you explain this Zionist talking point and why Israel still controls what goes in and out of the Gaza Strip?
Right. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but every good lawyer that I know considers that Israel continued to occupy and control the Gaza Strip from without, even after it removed its troops from Gaza, and even after it removed its settlers from Gaza in 2005. Why? Because the population register is still controlled by Israel. Entry and exit is still controlled by Israel. Import and export is still controlled by Israel. The airspace over Gaza and the sea space of Gaza is controlled by Israel. Every exit except the Rafah exit is controlled by Israel. And the Rafah exit, everybody who goes in and out is vetted by Israel before the Egyptians allow them. So the Egyptians are basically Bawamin, doormen for the Israeli security service. The Israeli security services control Rafah. Not effectively, completely, utterly. If you're not on the Israeli list, you do not enter or exit Rafah. So Israel controls the Gaza envelope entirely and completely and has since 2005. So it's true they did withdraw their troops. It's true they removed their settlers, blew up the settlement, destroyed everything before they left. But it's not true that Israel does not and has not controlled Gaza. That's a form of occupation. That's what the international lawyers I talk to say.
And then this question is for both Sinan and Rashid. Do you see a link between the security apparatus established in Palestine after Oslo and the security apparatus built in the US for the quote-unquote war on terror?
There are all kinds of things. If you go through Ben Gurion Airport, as I do, almost every year, sometimes several times you have learned every security protocol that you'll ever face in an American airport. That's where it all started. Starting with an attack by the PFLP and the army faction in 1972. From that point on, every time you take off your shoes, every time you go through an X-ray machine, every time you're asked the same idiotic questions, whether at Denver Airport or whether at LaGuardia or wherever it may be, you're essentially facing protocols that were developed in Israel. You're also facing, in many cases, in the United States, surveillance mechanisms and forms of control that were developed. Is it the same? No, it's not the same. But one of the things that Israel has managed to make itself very successful in is the export of security and control technology. And I saw an ad the other day by a senior executive of one of these firms saying, this stuff has been tested on Palestinians. It works. It's actually been combat tested. So you don't have to, install it at the Mexican border, or you don't have to install it at your embassy. We've already tested it for you on the Palestinians. And so this gives the Israelis an advantage in selling this stuff. They have a very high-tech security establishment. Didn't perform very well on the 7th of October, but still, they've succeeded in selling it as a successful example of this sort of thing. And the United States is quite enmeshed with it. There are many police services that send their officers to Israel to train, mainly with the Israeli border guards, paramilitary occupation force, which tells you something about the way in which American cities are policed. What's that?
No, I mean, there's nothing to add. The NYPD has an office in Tel Aviv. But also, since we spoke of Arab states, one aspect of the cooperation and the Abraham Accords is that the UAE and all of these countries want to use all of these methods to keep hounding and hunting their own citizens. And we all know about the Pegasus software that was used to assassinate activists from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. Right?
And then what similarities do you see between Palestine today and the South African apartheid? Many Zionists claim Israel isn't an apartheid state because they go to work or attend school in Israeli territories.
Because Arabs
go to work or attend school in Israeli territories. Can you explain the flaws in this talking point?
Right. Well, I mean, there's a legal definition of apartheid. again, I am not a lawyer, but walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, lays eggs like a duck. It's not. It fits the legal description. Are there two legal systems in the occupied territories? Yes, there are two legal systems. Are there enormous restrictions on the movement of Palestinians, like passes? Yes. Are Palestinians jammed into small parts of the territory? Yes. I mean, any test, whether a legal test or the eye test, would indicate that there are enormous similarities between apartheid and what Israel has imposed on the Palestinians. Certainly in occupied territories. I think an argument can be made that inside Israel, it's an extremely discriminatory system, is an apartheid, maybe not. But certainly in the occupied territories, you have two absolutely different legal systems. Israeli citizens are judged under Israeli law. Palestinians are judged under military law. They're two complete, and military law is a farce. 99% conviction rate. When they can't convict you, they put you under administrative detention. The number of Israeli citizens who have been put under administrative detention can be counted on the fingers of two hands. There are hundreds of Palestinians in administrative detention at any moment. Administrative detention is not just, like being kept after school. Administrative detention means you don't see a lawyer, you're not tried, there are no charges against you. They throw you away for 11 months, and then they can throw you away for another 11. I know people who've been in administrative detention for the better part of 17 years. Never tried, never had a lawyer, not even indicted. They don't know what the charges against them. I mean, that I've been told by South African friends who've been to Palestine, this is much worse than anything usually.
It seems as though there's a resurgence of official and international support for a two-state solution in the wake of this war, but the maximum Israeli concessions and the minimum Palestinian demands remain miles apart. Activists here seem uninterested in a two-state solution, preferring a one-state.
Right.
What, if any, path forward do you see, or does it matter to take a stance for one or the other?
Yeah, this is the how many states can dance on the head of a pin question. Frankly, I think it's entirely unrealistic to even talk about it. Anybody who's talking about a two-state solution would have to talk about an end to the occupation, a date certain for the end of the occupation, which has been going on for 56 years. 3 generations of Palestinians have lived under occupation, have been born and grown up under occupation. And that's not in the cards. That's not even being discussed. There's this airy-fairy discussion by the great powers of a two-state solution. Are you going to end the occupation? Are you going to remove Israeli security control? You don't do that, it's not state. Are you going to end colonization of the West Bank? There are 750,000, some people now say as many as 800,000, illegal Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank and occupied Arab East Jerusalem. They control 60% of the land. You don't reverse that process, not halt settlement expansion, undo the settlement process that has been unending since 1967. You're not talking about two states. So I personally think the discussion of two states without even beginning to talk about how you dismantle this structure of control and colonization and occupation is absurd. We're not on the verge of a two-state solution. Leaving aside whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, are Palestinians in favor of it? Most of them don't seem to be. Are Israelis in favor of it? Right now, no. So why is it being discussed? I would argue that, and I say this in the book, whatever resolution whatever resolution we come to for this to end this war, it has to be based on absolute and complete equality of rights. I personally don't care whether that comes through cantons, binational, multinational, single, multiple states, confederations. I personally don't care. That's my personal. I don't think any of those things are in the offing in any case. But if those solutions, one state, two state, confederation, canton, whatever it may be, binational state, if those solutions do not involve absolute and complete equality of rights, by which I mean national rights, you have two national communities here. Some people don't like to think about that. Israelis don't like to think about it. Palestinians don't like it. We have two national communities. Human rights, civil rights, property rights, religious rights. It doesn't include the resolution. Absolute equality of those rights. I have a relative in Brooklyn, I want to bring it, you have the right to bring it. I have a relative in Abu Dhabi, I want to bring it, you have the right to bring it. If you don't have equality in those things, it's not going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. It doesn't deserve to work. It is fundamentally unjust. That's my personal touchstone for whatever solution you talk about. The discussion right now, two states, is not about two states. It's about what Rabin talked about in the Knesset before they murdered him. It was less than a state. It was continued Israeli security control over the Palestinians. It is really not a two-state solution. It's a one state, one Baptist. That's what they're talking
about. And then our final question, what does reparations for Palestinians look like for you, and what are reparations for Gaza? What do you picture liberation?
You know, the first thing I want, actually, before we even get to reparations, is I want an apology and atonement from the United Kingdom. They started this. Other great powers that no longer with us, the Soviet Union, obviously the United States played a big role. But the people who really started it all and got us where we are the British. And they have to acknowledge that. That's the first thing. Reparations. Well, I think that there has to be compensation for people's losses. Losses in 1948, losses since then, and certainly losses of people in Gaza. You can't compensate people for the loss of loved ones, but you can certainly compensate people. And that should happen. Some people have said, well, what about the Jewish populations that were forced to leave Arab countries? They should also be compensated, right? And they should also, if they want to return and their countries are accepted, they should be allowed to return as well. To my way of thinking, those are things that are obvious. They're elemental in terms of justice, and they should all happen. Starting with British apology. I'd like to see the Prime Minister walk on his or her knees, Palestinian embassy, and apologize. Going to Knossos, Henry II.
Thank you for answering the questions, and sorry to those who weren't able to, those we weren't able to get in.
Can I say one more word?
Totally.
Yeah, I sent a shout out to the students who did this, and to those of you who are involved. And the faculty who support. We all feel beleaguered. Those of us who were, trying to stand up for Palestinian rights, but we actually represent a majority on our campuses in most cases, and in our society. Now, there are very powerful forces that are absolutely addicted to maintaining the status quo in Palestine, and they will not give up their control of our universities, of our politics, of the media easily. But that shouldn't discourage us. We represent a just cause. And we actually represent a majority. If you look at the polls, most Americans want a permanent ceasefire. Most Americans are now turning towards saying we should not be delivering the weapons that are killing Palestinians. So what we're arguing for is under pressure from this repression, governmental and otherwise. That does not mean that we don't represent not just a just cause, but actually a majority in this country. And that's the first time that's still the case. And so, it's tough to stand up for something that's under such enormous pressure. But you should take courage from the fact that there are a lot of people who really support this cause. Thank you.
Yeah, just in closing remarks with the annoying and unnecessary repressions on campus, we're really grateful for both the speakers for letting us have this event with you guys. So if we give another round of applause. Thank you everyone for joining us on Zoom and in person. If you guys have any further questions about SJP or getting involved on campus, follow us at NYU SJP. And also on another note, there's the Mehdi Hassan started a new news outlet called Zito News, which we recommend. But other than that, thank you so much, everyone.